Challenge coins have been collected by many people. They show where they've been, who they've met, what groups they've been affiliated with. I myself own many of them, but I was running out of storage space, so I figured, why not make a new coin rack? Stay tuned to see how I went from this to this.
I decided to go with cedar on oak because when they get poly on top, cedar gets a really nice dark blend of colors and oak is really nice light. I figured it'd be a nice contrast. Either way, it's a step up from my old coin rack, as you can see here. The design of this coin rack is actually quite simple. All it is half of a hexagon stacked 5 different times with different sizes on top of an oak platform. So what I have really is a 6-inch hexagon, a 5-inch, a 4-inch, a 3-inch, a 2-inch on top of an oak platform. And all that I did to make the hexagon was cut it into triangles. So let's check that out. I measured the longest cut on the cedar at 20 inches and then made my first cross cut on the table saw. I was measuring 2 inches over what I needed on each cut so that I would have enough wood to work with at the time of making the triangles. So what I did was, if I was cutting for the 5-inch hexagon tier, then I was cutting at 17 inches because 3 triangles at 5 inches makes 15 inches and then 2 inches extra for the extra wood. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm cutting at 17 inches, 14 inches, 11 inches, and 8 inches so that I have enough wood to work with for my triangles when I get there. After I cut my cedar, I went on to the oak and I cut at 23 inches to allow for a 7-inch depth base, and then I cut that on my table saw as well. I then went on to start cutting the depth of my cedar pieces. So I got my 20-inch piece, set the fence to 6 inches, and made my cut with the grain. Then I grabbed my 17-inch piece of cedar, set the fence to 5 inches, and again made a cut. And then with the 14-inch piece of cedar, I set my fence to 4 inches, made the cut. Then the 11-inch cedar got a 3-inch setting with a cut, and then finally the 8-inch cedar got a 2-inch setting on the fence and got a cut with the grain. Then I set my fence back to 7 inches for the measurement of the oak base, and I made my cut on the oak. Now that I had all my main cuts made, I had to flatten out one side of all of my pieces so that I could run them through the planer. So I took them all to the joiner and passed them along an even amount of times on each piece until I had a nice, smooth, flat surface on one side. But before I take these pieces to the planer, I now have a chance to make the narrower edges flat. Since I have a flat broad side, I can run that along the back side fence of my joiner and make the narrower edges flat, except of course for the oak, since I don't have any flat surfaces on that piece yet. But I will run that through the planer first before I do any of this, which we'll see in a couple seconds here. When I'm running all these pieces through the planer, I keep the flat side down that I got from my joiner, and what you want to do is you want to run them through an even amount of times on each piece until all surfaces are flat with no rough cut wood showing. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm running it through enough times to where each piece has a nice, smooth, flat surface on the top side, which is where the planer is cutting. And I have to make sure that each piece runs through the same amount of times as any other piece, so that they all have the same width. The oak piece is a little different though, because I never actually got a flat surface on one edge, and this is because it was too wide for my joiner. And instead of setting it up on any type of jig, this was the easiest route for me because it's one piece, it's small, and I'm not going to be putting too much pressure on it to make it bend or warp in any way other than what it already is. So I ran it through the planer, cutting until the top surface was smooth, and then I flipped it over and did it again. And once that's done, I'll take it back to the joiner and I'll make the two smaller edges flat. Finally, it's time to measure all of my cedar to cut into triangles. And what I ended up doing is I measured each piece in the 3 equal measurements that I've had pre-planned, the 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 inch increments. and then I put a halfway mark for each of those measurements to line up my 60-degree corner on a triangle to mark out the triangles. And it turned out that on the 6-inch piece it was a little bit too small. I couldn't line up the triangle on the middle mark with the two outside marks to make my perfect equilateral triangle, so I had to use a ruler on one edge of that triangle ruler to complete the mark. But I got it done, and I was able to take it to my table saw. I set up my miter sled by using the same triangle I used in measuring all of my cuts on the wood, and then I made one cut on a piece of wood to mount to my crosscut sled, so I had a solid base to just rest all of my cedar pieces on and cut and rip. And it worked okay, but I should have done one for the other side too. So I got one pre-cut piece of wood for the left side cut, and then the right side cut I had to eyeball. But it was okay, it worked out, and I was able to get everything done without having to make any other special type of jigs. And now that I have all the triangles for my tiers, I can start cutting the channels for the coins to sit in. So I set my saw to 1/4 inch above the table, and I moved the fence a 1/4 inch away from the saw, and I cut the first channels into all of my triangles. Once all of the channels are cut, I then move my fence another 1/8 of an inch away from the blade, and I make one more cut in all of my triangles. And then for the third cut, I set the fence another 1/8 of an inch away, but I don't cut into the 2-inch triangles. I want those channels a little narrower because the top coins I don't want to lean back so much. Now that I have all my shapes and channels, it's time to take them to the router and give it just a little bit of a rounded edge so that the display is nice and smooth and nobody nicks their fingers on anything, and it's a pleasure to look at. And then the first daunting sanding test begins. What I'm doing here is I'm sanding each edge on the belt sander to make it as flat as possible so that there is no gap between each triangle when it's joined together. That will guarantee that I have the most perfect half of a hexagon that I can get by hand. Once I have all of the edges as straight as possible, I can then start hand sanding all the other surfaces of the cedar. And what I do is I start with 150 grit and I sand every surface including inside of the channel, and then I go to 220 grit and do the same thing again. And that should give me a smooth enough surface for what I'm trying to accomplish here. Finally, with all the sanding done, I can start gluing the pieces together. So I set them up on top of just a scrap piece of wood, and I glue all the inside surfaces on the bottom tier, and then every tier above it I glue the inside surfaces and the bottom surfaces. I just keep stacking it up, line it up just by eye, and get it as close as I can to a perfect half of a hexagon. And then I glue it all together with a clamp and let it dry overnight. After the coin rack has had a chance to dry overnight, I can remove the clamps and separate it from the scrap wood with a putty knife. After I have it separated, it's back to the belt sander. I'm going to give the back of my hexagonal pyramid a nice smooth surface to work with. Once I establish that back smooth surface, it's time to hand sand again. And really all that I'm doing it for right now is to remove any glue remnants and to make the surfaces smooth for an epoxy coating coming up here in a few minutes. But any of the glue that I can't get with the sandpaper, I get with a razor blade, and then I sand as best as I can. When it comes to applying the epoxy, you gotta act fast, because 1 minute epoxy is just that. It sets in 1 minute and then it's solid. So don't pour too much at once and then mix it and think that it's going to be able to sit for a while you're working with this. Do a little bit at a time and add it to wherever you need it, and then mix it again. Otherwise you're going to end up wasting a lot of epoxy. Anyway, what I did was I filled all of the cracks that were on the outer visible edges of this half hexagon pyramid with epoxy and let it set well enough for me to sand it. And that will give me a nice smooth surface to cover with polyurethane. Before putting epoxy on the back, I make sure to take my width measurement so I don't get stuck to a table with the ruler. And then after that, I go ahead and apply the epoxy to the back seam. Since my cedar pyramid was 12 inches wide, I'm going to go ahead and measure the oak to 18 inches to give me 3 extra inches on each side to work with for anything I feel like displaying once this whole thing is finished. So I mark it 18 inches, and then I go and cut it on the table saw. Then after the table saw cut, I go ahead and put a nice Roman OG edge on my oak piece so that it's aesthetic and pleasing to look at. I make sure not to put an edge on the back piece of the wood because that's going to be flat like the cedar. And then it's time to do another meticulous sanding. So I get out my random orbital sander and I start with 150 grit on the oak, and then I move to hand sanding with 220 grit, and then I take it to 320 grit because this should be my final sanding on the oak before I glue the cedar on top of it and then put the polyurethane coating. Now that the oak is done, the epoxy is dried enough on my cedar to give it a good sanding. So I start with a rougher grit to get the epoxy off that I don't need quicker. So I start with 120, and then I go down to my 150, and then 220, and then my 320 to give the cedar a final sanding. And on the orbital sander, you'll notice on the top, I let it go until the complete surface on the top was as flat as possible. And I didn't really care about going with the grain on the orbital sander at the time, but had I had a chance to do it again, I probably wouldn't have taken the orbital sander to the top. But that's just a little minor detail that you don't even notice now that it's finished. With the final sanding on the oak and the cedar accomplished, I can now glue the two pieces together and clamp it and let that sit overnight once again. So now we're on day 3, and I once again remove my clamp and give the coin rack a good sanding to remove any glue remnants that might have snuck out during the drying process. And then before I put on any polyurethane coating, I give the piece a nice wipe down, first with a dry paper towel and then with a tack cloth. For my first coat of polyurethane, I am not going to do anything with a brush. I'm going to do the wipe on. And I do this because it gives it a nice seal on the wood, and I feel that when I do the brush, I don't get as good of a seal, and I miss stuff once in a while with a brush. So a nice wipe on coat by hand first is what I tend to do. Plus, the hand applied poly dries faster. And after about 3 hours, the piece is ready to be sanded with 320 grit so that I can apply another coat of polyurethane. It's important to know that polyurethane, it really doesn't adhere to itself. That's why you have to sand it. Otherwise, it's going to become a bad finish. And of course, after every sanding, wipe your piece down to take away any remnants from the sanding itself. I actually tried something new with this piece. I've never used the brush-on clear gloss polyurethane before. So after this first coat of the hand poly, I went ahead and put on this brush coat, and then I let that dry overnight. I was actually fairly impressed with the clear gloss polyurethane that I brushed on, and the only bad thing that I have to say is that I did not wait long enough for it to dry before I sanded it. The brush on poly, you have to give a fair amount of time to dry, and with the amount of humidity that I'm currently dealing with, one night wasn't enough. So I ended up with a couple of blemishes, and it's not that noticeable, but I can notice it. But that's because I made the piece. I'm sure that other people that look at these pieces don't notice as much as I do. But anyway, you want to sand the poly until the surface is smooth. There should be no dimples or blemishes in any of the surface before you put on your final coat. After that final sanding, it's time for the final wiping down, and then it's on to the final finish. And for me, wipe on poly is the final finish. even after doing a brush on poly, because with a brush on poly I can never get it perfect. There's always a little streak or a blemish, or I didn't sand something good enough, and I know that's probably because of my inexperience, but the easiest thing to annul all that is to do a coat of wipe on poly at the end. So that's what I did. The final touch of this coin rack is the felt that lays inside the channels where the coins rest. And all that I did was I turned the felt upside down and I measured 3/16 of an inch up on each side and then made cuts with a razor to make strips that were 3/16 inches in thickness. And it's important to note that you need a sharp razor to make these cuts. As you can see, I had a hard time with an X-Acto blade and a utility knife, and I had to get a brand new razor blade to make these cuts. Then I'll take all the felt strips and I will cut them to fit in all the channels and then stick them to the front and the back sides of each channel of each tier of the coin rack. As the last step, I'm going to add 6 felt pads to the bottom of the rack so that any surfaces it rests on don't get scratched. And voila! A finished coin rack. Thanks for watching.